Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Eli McAllister wanted nothing more than peace on his land, 15 acres of solitude free from interference. But when a ruthless HOA declared his property under their control, demanding fees and obedience, they made a grave mistake. Eli wasn't one to bow to bullies, and this time they picked the wrong man to fight. Elias Eli McAllister had always valued independence. After retiring from a career as a military engineer, he sought peace and quiet, something he had never truly had during years of deployments, deadlines, and high-stakes decisions. So when he found a sprawling 15-acre property on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, he knew it was perfect. The land was lined with towering oak trees, shielding him from prying eyes, and the main house, though simple, had a sturdy charm that he had every intention of maintaining. The best part? It was completely free from the constraints of a homeowners association. For years, Eli lived contentedly. He spent his days tending to his vegetable garden, reinforcing the fences for his horses, and making improvements to his house as he saw fit. The world beyond his property line felt distant. He rarely interacted with neighbors and liked it that way. The nearest residential development, Willow Creek, was a gated community with identical homes and meticulously maintained lawns, governed by an overbearing homeowners association. But Eli's land had never been part of Willow Creek. He had checked thoroughly before buying. The HOA had no jurisdiction over him, and he preferred to keep it that way. That's why, on a crisp October morning, when he received a formal-looking envelope marked Willow Creek Homeowners Association, he frowned. At first, he assumed it was a mistake, junk mail perhaps. But as he read the letter, irritation flickered into something much sharper. The HOA claimed that after a recent expansion of jurisdiction, his property now fell under their governance. Effective immediately, he was expected to pay annual fees of $1,500, adhere to their strict property maintenance codes, and address several violations, including an unauthorized fence height, non-standard mailbox design, and an unapproved metal roof on his garage. Additionally, he had been fined $3,000 for non-compliance. Eli chuckled dryly. It wasn't the first time he had dealt with bureaucratic nonsense, but this was outright absurd. He had never agreed to any HOA regulations, nor had he signed any contract binding him to their authority. The idea that they could unilaterally claim control over his property was laughable. With a shake of his head, he crumpled the letter and tossed it into the fireplace, watching the flames consume it. The next morning, as Eli sipped his coffee on the porch, a sleek black SUV pulled into his gravel driveway. A tall, thin woman in a pristine blazer stepped out, clipboard in hand. Two large men dressed in HOA-branded polo shirts flanked her. Their presence alone set Eli's instincts on edge. This wasn't a neighborly visit. "Mr. McAllister?" the woman called out, flashing a tight, professional smile. Eli set down his coffee cup. "Who's asking?" She strode closer, extending a manicured hand that he ignored. "Cassandra Hall, president of the Willow Creek HOA. I assume you received our notice." "I did," Eli said, folding his arms. "And I tossed it where it belongs." Cassandra's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "I understand that this may be unexpected, but our association has recently expanded its jurisdiction to include your property. Moving forward, you'll be required to comply with our community standards." Eli let out a low chuckle. "Is that so? Because last I checked, I never signed a damn thing agreeing to that." A flicker of annoyance crossed her face, but she quickly recovered. "It's not a matter of choice, Mr. McAllister. Willow Creek's community bylaws apply to all properties within the new boundary. You're expected to make the necessary adjustments by the end of the month to avoid further penalties." Eli stepped down from the porch, closing the distance between them. "Let me make something clear. This is my land, my house. You have no authority here." Cassandra pursed her lips and glanced at the men beside her. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a clipboard labeled enforcement officer, took a step forward. "Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and, if necessary, legal action," he said. Eli stared at them for a long moment before smirking. "We'll see about that." Without another word, he turned and walked back inside, slamming the door behind him. He had a feeling this was only the beginning. The next morning, Eli stepped outside to find a bright red violation notice nailed to his fence. This property is in non-compliance with Willow Creek HOA standards. Immediate action required. Below, a list of supposed violations stretched down the page. Unauthorized fencing material, improper landscaping, and failure to submit architectural modifications for approval. The fine at the bottom had jumped to $6,000. Eli tore the notice off and crumpled it in his fist. This wasn't just bureaucratic overreach anymore. This was harassment. He stormed back inside, grabbed his phone, and called his lawyer, Thomas Grant. "They're trying to claim jurisdiction over your land without your consent," Grant said, clearly irritated. "That's not how it works. Did they send any legal documentation proving this expansion?" "Not a damn thing," Eli growled. "Good. Then they don't have a case." Grant said, "Send me everything they've sent you. I'll draft a formal challenge. In the meantime, do not pay them a cent." Feeling a surge of confidence, Eli hung up and went about his day. But by the afternoon, it became clear that the HOA had no intention of backing down. A black SUV rolled up again, this time parking directly in front of his driveway. Cassandra Hall stepped out, followed by two men with clipboards and cameras. Eli immediately recognized one of them, Stephen Barkley, the HOA's so-called enforcement officer, who had looked a little too smug during their last encounter. Before they could say a word, Eli strode toward them. "Unless you're delivering a pizza, I'd suggest you turn your asses around." Cassandra's smile was razor-thin. "Mr. McAllister, we're here to perform an inspection. Since you have chosen to ignore our notices, the HOA is exercising its right to document your continued violations." Eli took a step closer, his voice dangerously low. "You don't have the right to set foot on my property." Cassandra didn't flinch, but Barkley's grip tightened on his clipboard. "Your fence is an eyesore," Cassandra continued, ignoring his warning. "It disrupts the uniform aesthetic of the community." "Good," Eli said. "I wouldn't want anyone mistaking me for one of your docile little sheep." She exhaled sharply. "We're simply trying to maintain a standard of excellence, Mr. McAllister. Your refusal to cooperate is forcing our hand." Barkley lifted his camera and snapped a picture of Eli's house. That was the last straw. Eli reached out, snatched the camera from Barkley's hands, and threw it onto the gravel driveway with a satisfying crunch. Barkley took a startled step back, and Cassandra's expression darkened. "That," she said coldly, "was a mistake." Eli grinned. "So was coming here." Without another word, Cassandra turned sharply on her heel. "You'll be hearing from us soon," she said over her shoulder. "I can't wait," Eli muttered as the SUV sped off. That night, he installed security cameras around his property. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were about to get one. The next morning, Eli woke up to a new kind of violation. His front gate was missing. The heavy wooden beams that had stood for years were gone, leaving behind only sawed-off posts and tire tracks in the dirt. A laminated notice was stapled to one of the remaining posts. "Unauthorized barrier removed per Willow Creek HOA compliance guidelines. Property must remain accessible for community oversight." Eli clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. They had trespassed. They had come onto his land in the dead of night and stolen his property, all under the guise of some fabricated authority. Without hesitation, he stormed inside and called his lawyer. "Thomas, they took my damn gate." There was a beat of silence before Grant swore under his breath. "That's theft, Eli. Straight-up criminal activity. I'll draft a cease and desist letter immediately and report this to the county sheriff. In the meantime, check your security footage. We need to catch them red-handed." Eli wasted no time. He pulled up the previous night's recordings from the cameras he had installed. Sure enough, at 2:37 a.m., two unmarked white trucks had rolled up to his property. 5 figures wearing black HOA-branded jackets stepped out, carrying power tools. He zoomed in on the face of one of them, Stephen Barkley, the so-called enforcement officer. Eli's blood boiled. By noon, he was standing in the county sheriff's office, handing over his security footage, violation notices, and a list of every interaction he'd had with the HOA. The sheriff, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Jim Caldwell, reviewed the evidence, his expression darkening with every passing minute. "This is bad," Caldwell muttered. "Real bad. They had no legal right to remove your gate, and trespassing at that hour?" He exhaled sharply. "I'll get my deputies to look into it, but be warned. These HOA types usually have lawyers lined up, and they'll try to make this a civil dispute instead of criminal charges." Eli leaned forward. "I don't care how many lawyers they have. They broke the law, and they're going to pay for it." Caldwell gave him a firm nod. "I like your style, McAllister. Sit tight. We'll handle this." Eli returned home, half expecting more vandalism. Instead, he found something even more brazen. A bright yellow sticker was plastered onto his front door. "Notice of Lion. This property is subject to HOA mandated penalties. A lien will be placed due to unpaid compliance fees totaling $18,500. Immediate resolution required." Eli laughed. A cold, dangerous laugh. They were trying to take his damn property now. Less than an hour later, Cassandra Hall herself showed up, this time with a uniformed officer in tow, but not from the sheriff's department. It was a private security officer, one of the HOA's hired enforcers, his badge reading Willow Creek Security Division. "Mr. McAllister," Cassandra greeted him with a smug expression. "I see you received our notice." Eli leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed. "You're standing on my property, issuing threats." Again. "This isn't a threat," she corrected smoothly. "This is procedure. Your continued non-compliance has forced us to take steps to recover outstanding fees. The lien on your property will remain until you settle your debts." Eli smirked. "You mean the debts I never agreed to?" Cassandra sighed dramatically. "Mr. McAllister, this can all be resolved if you simply work with us. Pay the fines, update your property to meet our standards, and you'll have no more trouble." Eli stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You broke into my land, stole my gate, and now you're trying to steal my home. Let me make one thing clear. You're the ones about to have trouble." Cassandra's confident facade wavered for a split second before she recovered. "We'll see about that," she murmured before turning away. Eli didn't watch her leave. He was already on the phone with his lawyer. "They filed a lien," he said the moment Grant picked up. There was a pause. "Oh, they just screwed themselves." That evening, 3 sheriff's deputies arrived at the Willow Creek HOA office with warrants in hand. Barkley and 2 other HOA enforcers were taken into custody for trespassing, vandalism, and conspiracy to commit fraud. News of their arrest spread fast, faster than Cassandra had anticipated. Eli sat back on his porch that night, watching the local news broadcast with his feet kicked up and a cold beer in hand. The Willow Creek HOA faces legal scrutiny after alleged unlawful enforcement actions against a local resident. Sheriff Jim Caldwell has confirmed that further investigations are underway, with potential criminal charges against multiple HOA board members. Eli smirked. Now it was their turn to be afraid. Eli didn't waste a second. With his lawyer, Thomas Grant, leading the charge, they filed a lawsuit against the Willow Creek HOA for property damage, harassment, trespassing, and fraudulent liens. The sheriff's department had already initiated a criminal investigation, but Eli wasn't about to stop there. He wanted them buried in legal trouble. 2 days after the arrests of Barkley and his enforcers, Cassandra Hall held a press conference, standing in front of the gleaming Willow Creek HOA office. Cameras flashed as she addressed the allegations. "These accusations are completely baseless," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the stress behind the facade. "Our association has always acted within the bounds of the law. Mr. McAllister's refusal to comply with basic community standards has led to unfortunate misunderstandings, but we are confident that the court will find in our favor." Eli, watching from home, smirked. She was already on the defensive. That same afternoon, HOA lawyers flooded Grant's office with counterclaims. They tried to argue that Eli had damaged community aesthetics, failed to maintain his property, and created a hostile living environment for other residents. Grant read through the nonsense before tossing the papers onto his desk. "They're grasping at straws, Eli. They have zero legal ground to stand on." Eli leaned forward. "How fast can we crush them?" Grant grinned. "Fast." The first major blow came a week later when county officials ruled that the HOA's jurisdiction expansion was unlawful. The boundary adjustments they had claimed to justify their takeover of Eli's property? Null and void. The next day, a judge threw out the fraudulent lien on Eli's property, calling it a blatant attempt at coercion through intimidation. Then came the homeowner revolt. After seeing Eli fight back, other Willow Creek residents started stepping forward. It turned out Eli wasn't the first person they had targeted. A retired couple revealed that HOA fines had forced them to remortgage their home just to stay afloat. A single mother detailed how the HOA had threatened her with eviction for having an unapproved mailbox. A veteran on disability testified that Willow Creek HOA had sent debt collectors after him for unpaid community fees on a property he legally owned outright. Suddenly, the legal battle wasn't just Eli versus the HOA, it was the entire community against them. As public support shifted, Cassandra and the remaining board members scrambled to save themselves. They tried to settle, offering to drop all claims against Eli if he withdrew his lawsuit. He laughed in their faces. They fired their security officers, blaming Barkley and his crew for the illegal trespassing. Too little, too late. Then came the final nail in the coffin, an audit of the HOA's financial records. County officials found hundreds of thousands of dollars in unaccounted fees, hidden expenditures, and misappropriated funds. Money that was supposed to go toward maintaining Willow Creek's roads and parks had been funneled into board member bonuses, luxury office renovations, and even personal vacations. When the evidence was presented in court, Cassandra Hall finally cracked. Facing criminal fraud charges, she resigned in disgrace, her once smug demeanor shattered. The remaining board members soon followed, desperately trying to avoid prison time. A month later, the Willow Creek HOA was officially dissolved. Eli stood outside the now-abandoned HOA office, watching as workers removed the association's signage from the building. The very organization that had tried to steal his land was gone. As he walked back to his truck, a few former HOA victims approached him. One of them, an elderly man with tears in his eyes, shook Eli's hand. "You saved us." Eli smirked, gripping his hand firmly. We saved ourselves. With the Willow Creek HOA officially dissolved, the aftermath of its downfall rippled through the entire community. Residents who had once lived in fear of absurd fines and intimidation tactics were finally free. For the first time in years, they could paint their houses the color they wanted, install mailboxes of their choice, and park their trucks in their own driveways without worrying about a citation. Eli watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had never set out to be a hero. He just wanted to be left alone, but in standing up for himself, he had unwittingly become a symbol of resistance, proving that no one had to bow to corrupt authority. The former HOA office, once a pristine building filled with smug board members and power-hungry enforcers, now stood abandoned, the windows dark, the parking lot empty. The county had seized control of the property and was in the process of auctioning it off to repay homeowners who had been scammed out of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, Cassandra Hall and her cronies weren't so lucky. After pleading guilty to fraud and financial misconduct, she faced a 5-year prison sentence, while the remaining board members either struck deals with prosecutors or fled the community in disgrace. The neighborhood gossip was that Cassandra's luxurious home, purchased with HOA money, was being repossessed to cover legal costs. A few weeks after the lawsuit settled, Eli received the final paperwork declaring his land permanently free from any HOA claims. There would be no more threats, no more fines, and certainly no more stolen gates. As a final touch, he reinstalled his gate, but this time he made it bigger, stronger, and topped with a bold metal sign that read, "Private property. HO trespassers will be shot. Survivors will be fined." The local paper ran a photo of him standing next to it, arms crossed, grinning from ear to ear. It went viral. Surprisingly, many of the former HOA members approached Eli, not in anger, but in gratitude. Without the HOA's stranglehold, the residents finally came together as an actual community. They formed a neighborhood watch that was voluntary, not enforced through fear. They pooled resources for a real community fund that went toward improving shared spaces, instead of lining the pockets of corrupt board members. And in a twist that made Eli chuckle, many of the same people who had once voted for the HOA's strict rules now admitted they had hated them the whole time. At a community barbecue hosted by one of his grateful neighbors, a man raised a beer in Eli's direction and shouted, "To McAllister, the man who took down the HOA." The whole crowd cheered. As Eli sat on his porch that night, watching the sun set over his now truly free land, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. They had tried to take his home, they had tried to break him, and they had failed. Eli sat on his porch, a cold beer in hand, watching the golden hues of the sunset spill across his land. The battle was over. The HOA was gone, its leaders disgraced, and its influence erased. His property was truly his again, No fines, no threats, no fabricated violations, just freedom. For the first time in months, there were no legal papers to sign, no security footage to review, no underhanded schemes to unravel. Only silence and peace. The media had eaten the story alive. Headlines like, "The Man Who Took Down an HOA," and "Eli McAllister's Stand Against Corrupt Housing Tyranny" circulated across the country. He had been contacted by homeowners from other states, people inspired by his defiance, asking for advice on how to fight back against their own overreaching associations. But Eli had never done this to be a hero. He had fought because it was his land, and no one was going to take it from him. HOAs thrived on fear. They relied on the fact that most people would rather comply than fight, that people would rather pay the fines, avoid the hassle, and keep their heads down instead of risking conflict. But what Cassandra Hall and her board members had never understood was that not everyone folds under pressure. Some people push back. Some people stand their ground. And when they do, bullies crumble. The truth was, Willow Creek HOA had never expected anyone to challenge them. They had spent years scaring people into obedience, believing themselves untouchable, until Eli McAllister. And once he fought back, others found the courage to do the same. Willow Creek had changed. Without the HOA's grip, neighbors started helping each other out instead of policing one another. Instead of threats, there were actual conversations. Instead of fines, people started offering assistance to those who needed it. The irony wasn't lost on Eli. Without the HOA's suffocating rules, the neighborhood was better than ever. One afternoon, a group of residents stopped by his property with an invitation. Eli, one of them said, "We're having a meeting to talk about building something real." Not another HOA, just a neighborhood that actually looks out for one another. No fines, no stupid rules, just a community. You in? Eli smirked. "I'm in, as long as you keep those damn clipboard people away from me." Laughter erupted, and for the first time, Eli felt not just like a homeowner, but a part of something bigger. As Eli sat back on his porch that night, he thought about everything he had learned. People will try to take what's yours, whether it's money, property, or power over your life. They'll tell you that you have no choice but to obey. They'll try to convince you that fighting back isn't worth the trouble. But here's the thing. It's always worth it. Because when you stand your ground, when you refuse to be bullied, when you demand what's rightfully yours, you win. It might not be easy, it might not be quick, but you win. Eli took one last sip of his beer, exhaled, and smiled. The fight was over, and he had won.